Ever since I was a little girl, my grandmother was a talkative and caring person. Many people always gathered around her, and she was a person with a mysterious charm. My husband, who touched her angry heartstrings, was instilled with such fear that he could not approach us anymore because of her mysterious power. My name is Ruthie. I have been married to my husband Jackson for 2 years now, and we have been blessed with the child we have always wanted. I wanted to have a child right after marriage, but due to a difference of opinion with my husband, we finally decided to have a child after 2 years. From the beginning of our marriage, my husband was not very interested in children and was not actively seeking to have children. It was not that my husband disliked children, but he wanted to spend more time together first. My husband and I were both still young, and I agreed with him because I felt there was no need of rush. We thought we would wait for the right time when we both wanted to have children. However, about 6 months ago, my husband suddenly became very active in our fertility activities, and within a few months, I became pregnant. I was very happy about that, but I couldn't help but wonder what made him change all of a sudden. I asked my husband why, and it seemed that it was because he had heard that a woman he knew had become ill and was unable to give birth, which made him anxious. My husband and I are still young in age and have no significant health problems. However, my husband felt that this would not last forever. It was understandable that he wanted to have children while he was still healthy, so that if something happened to him, he would not regret it. In fact, my husband told me that he knew a woman who had not given birth before her illness and regretted it terribly. Considering the woman's regret, it is fair enough to make him feel that way. Normally, we tend to think of such stories as irrelevant to us, or they have nothing to do with us, even though we see those stories on the internet. However, when I hear that such a thing has happened to someone close to my husband, I suddenly felt a sense of reality. That is why I agreed with my husband's opinion. As a result, I am very happy that I was able to be pregnant. It is true that I became pregnant somewhat hastily because of this, but I've always wanted a child, and I am very much looking forward to the time of birth. The same was true for my husband, my in-laws, and my mother and grandmother who lived at home with me and were eagerly awaiting the day our new family would grow. Then, a few months passed after I became pregnant, and less than a month before my due date. My grandmother and mother asked me if I would like to have a home birth. My grandmother and mother suggested that we go back home to have the baby. My grandmother in particular seemed to really want me to have the baby back home, and was very enthusiastic about the idea. I just want to see my first great-grandchild as soon as possible. Think of it as a present for you, old lady, who has a short life ahead of her, huh? My grandmother, who is over 90 years old and bedridden, does this whenever anything happens. I don't know how many times I have heard her say, "I have a short life ahead." I can't tell you how many times I've heard she says this, and yet she always seems to be in such good health. Besides, the time I could actually spend with my grandmother is limited. So with this in mind, I decided to comply with my grandmother's wishes. My grandmother's strong wish was to have my baby back home, but it took a lot of convincing for my husband to go through with it. My grandmother had the personality that she is quite upfront and good at talking to people. She was bedridden and showed such vitality that it was hard to believe that she was over 90 years old. Even now, she often engages in chats with neighbors who come to check on her. The relentless words and actions that come out of this personality are the same towards my husband, let alone to me, her granddaughter. Combined with the fact that she says things that make me feel certain, my husband seems to have a bit of a hard time with my grandmother. My husband was not at all comfortable with the idea of going home to my grandmother's house to give birth. Perhaps that is why my husband was reluctant when I told him that I wanted to have a home birth and did not nod at all. But it was also my grandmother who changed his mind. She was on the phone with my husband, using her own short life expectancy as a shield, as usual, asking him what she ought to do if she did not get to see her first great-granddaughter's face. As a result, she managed to get my husband's permission to have our baby back home, although he seemed reluctant to do so. I couldn't help but laugh at the situation, but my husband is very busy with his work and is often away from home. Even besides this thing with her, It was true that I felt safer having the baby back home. When I returned to my parents' home for the first time in a long time, I thought that my grandmother was still in good health. Since my father and grandfather passed away, my grandmother and mother have been living together, but their relationship is great. My grandmother talks a lot and my mother smiles as she listens to her. My grandmother is from the father's side, so they are not related by blood, but their relationship is so trusting that one does not feel that way. I was happy to see their relationship, which almost made me jealous, but what surprised me even more was the number of visitors to my grandmother. Many people would come to see her even when I still lived with her, but even though she is now lying down in her bed all the time, people keep coming, some to check on her, others to ask for advice, and so on. People of all ages show up at my parents' house day after day. The age range is wide, from people not much older than me to people about the same age as my grandmother. My husband and I first met at my grandmother's house, and since I have seen this kind of scene since I was a child, I thought I was used to it, but after a long time, I was impressed again. My grandmother speaks her mind and her tone of voice is not always beautiful. However, she always chose her words with the other person in mind and never turned her eyes away from them. This attitude is what makes her the person she is today, and is probably the reason why people still love her even after her illness. I was comfortable living with my grandmother, who had such a mysterious charm, and my kind mother, and I lived a peaceful life after I returned to my hometown. A few weeks had passed since I returned to my hometown, and my due date was approaching. Suddenly my grandmother said this to me: "Ruthie, don't go back to your home after giving birth. There's nothing good for you back home, so stay here." My grandmother said this with a more serious face than ever before. I laughed, wondering what kind of joke it was, but she stared at me without changing her serious expression. I was so confused that I could only make a vague face at that moment. My grandmother went straight to sleep, so I immediately went to my mother for advice, and she smiled and convinced me to listen to my grandmother's words. "Actually, your grandma, she has a mysterious power. She must have a bad feeling about this. You better listen to your grandmother." My mother smiles with a look of conviction, but I can't believe such an unrealistic story. I am sure that my grandmother said this because she thought she would miss me returning home after the birth of my child. My mother may have been thinking of my grandmother's feelings and told me to stay at home. I decided to think so and told my husband about it that night. Then my husband was surprised. "What? It's unusual for your mother to joke like that, let alone your grandmother." "I know, right? I was so surprised." We had a light-hearted laugh and I quickly forgot about it. A few days later, I was due to give birth, and the baby was born without incident. Unfortunately, my husband was too busy with work and could not be present, but he agreed to come and pick me up once I and the child were settled, and it was decided that I would stay with my parents for a while longer. After a short stay in the hospital, I was discharged and spent my days waiting for my husband with our newborn daughter. A little later, my husband came to pick up my daughter and I as promised, but without my knowledge, he was turned away at the door by my mother. I didn't even know that happened till my husband contacted me. He said, "So your mother told me to go home. Do you know why?" I learned about the situation for the first time when my husband sent me that message. I don't know why, and my husband seemed confused, so I immediately went to my mother and grandmother to find out why. "I told you it would be better for you not to return after the birth. That's why I asked Mr. Jackson to leave." My grandmother then replied with a look that said it was obvious and the reason why she returned him. I thought she was joking or something when she said that, but it never occurred to me that my grandmother was serious. But even if she was serious, I couldn't admit to such a thing, and I immediately protested. However, neither my grandmother nor my mother will take me seriously. On the contrary, they both try to talk me out of it. I can feel it. "I know you will regret it if you go back, so you must do as I say." My mother said that she had found that out through my grandmother's mysterious power, but there was no way I would believe such a ridiculous story. I was worried that my grandmother had finally got dementia or something, but even my mother nodded with a serious face, so I didn't know what the hell was going on. But when I said I was unconvinced, my grandmother muttered, "It can't be helped. Mr. Jackson is coming back his next day off. I'll talk to him then, and if you still want to go home, you can do whatever you want." Instead, I was told that she was the only one allowed to talk to him when he came to pick me up, and that I was not allowed to intervene. I was also told that I am not allowed to contact him until he comes to pick me up. To be honest, I thought if this was some kind of a skit, but my mother and grandmother both had serious expressions on their faces, and they didn't look like they were joking. Besides, even if I raised my voice any further, they would not listen to me. So I reluctantly decided to take my grandmother's suggestion. A few days later, it was the weekend, and my husband came to my parents' house as promised. I greeted him lightly and invited him into the house. He seemed somewhat nervous because he had been turned away the other day, but other than that, there was nothing unusual about him, and he went straight to my grandmother and mother. My mother is holding my newborn daughter, and my husband quickly reaches for the child, but it is the grandmother who stopped it. "Before greeting your beautiful child, I want to make sure of something." My husband turned to her saying so, looking at her suspiciously. She told him to make himself comfortable, and then began to talk to him as if they were making small talk. "How is Mrs. Ursula doing?" The grandmother's casual remark changed the color of my husband's face. It is probably a woman's name. I had no idea who she was talking about. I was puzzled. As if leaving me and my husband out of it, my grandmother went on with her story. "Yesterday, the two of you went shopping at a department store in front of the station, didn't you? Did you get the baby items you wanted?" My husband's eyes widened in astonishment at my grandmother's words. His complexion was worse than before, and he was sweating so much that I could see it. But on the contrary, I am left baffled as to the meaning of my grandmother's statement. To begin with, I don't even know who the woman in question is, and I don't understand what it means for my husband to go shopping for baby items with her. My husband opened his mouth, squeezing out a word with a bitter look, as if he can't afford to pay attention to me. "How do you know that?" In contrast to him, my grandmother replies in a cheerful voice, "Ruthie told you, didn't she, about my mysterious power? I know all of your moves." The husband looked at my grandmother, smiling as if he did not understand her. My husband muttered, "You're talking nonsense," and denied her words without effort, but her next words left him completely speechless. "Ursula can't get pregnant because she's sick and had a total hysterectomy, right? So what on earth were you buying all that baby stuff for? Maybe you were getting another child somewhere else." My husband, who had been showered by her words, turned his head down and said nothing. Although ambiguously, I was starting to understand what was going on. The name Ursula still didn't ring a bell, but I had heard that my husband knew someone who had been unable to conceive because of an illness. That person is definitely Miss Ursula. But my grandmother is right. Why would she need to buy baby items? And with my husband? I had a bad feeling, though I didn't completely understand, and an unpleasant perspiration began to run down my spine. "I could tell you, but why don't you at least say it yourself at the end? Otherwise you will regret it." This in response to my grandmother's statement. My husband slowly raised his head and looked at me. Then, in a quiet voice, he told me the truth of the matter. "I was going to divorce you after bringing our child home today." Hearing this quietly spoken plan, I involuntarily felt fear for my husband. My husband thought about remarrying Ursula, with whom he had been having an affair, but Ursula was unable to have children due to an illness. My husband took pity on her and decided to have a child with me instead. Even if it was only half the blood, the baby was his child. It would be better than adopting a stranger. So with this in mind, he consulted with Ursula and actively worked with me to conceive a child. And today, he came to pick up the child that was born as a result. In other words, he didn't care about me. As long as he could bring his child home, that was all that mattered. I felt fear in my husband's every word as he spoke so blandly. I felt as if my husband in front of me was an incomprehensible and unpleasant being. At the same time, I felt an inexpressible anger welling up inside me. And as if to speak for me, my grandmother told my husband that she would never give him a child. I will not let you take my great-grandchildren under any circumstances. So give up and divorce Ruthie." He shakes his shoulders in fear as she looks at him. In her anger at my husband, I had forgotten that my grandmother's mysterious power was real, and it was only natural that the husband should be afraid of this mysterious grandmother. "Understood. From now on, you mess with my grandchildren and great-grandchildren a little bit, and then I won't be as calm as I am now." Saying this, she leaned forward slightly from the bed where she was lying down. "I'm going to use my mysterious power to curse you." The husband, who had been sobbing and crawling away from my grandmother, who laughed like a witch, left my parents' house. Afterwards, I thanked my grandmother and mother for what had happened and told them that I was amazed at their mysterious power. My grandmother and mother laughed hysterically when they saw me. "There is no such thing as a mysterious power," they both said, laughing. In fact, what my grandmother did was simply to talk about what she had learned from other people. My husband's parents found out about my husband's plan and talked to my grandmother about it shortly before I had my baby back home. When she heard this story, she called me up and continued to investigate my husband using her extensive friendships. She also told me that she had been trying to get me to talk to my husband about the mysterious power she had by telling me about it. Whether my husband believed her or not, he would recognize her as a mysterious being, and he would not bother me or our children in the future. She thought so and went ahead with this plan without telling me. As a result, my grandmother's plan was a great success, and my husband was able to reach an agreement without any complaints about alimony or child support, and he insisted on giving me custody of the children. I was so convinced that it was also thanks to the mysterious power that my grandmother and mother had come up with that I began to wonder if it really existed.